Hello there, Internet. This is the Remnant Podcast, a product of the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. And I am, very obviously, or maybe not obviously to everybody who thinks that we sound alike, I am not Jonah Goldberg, who is away. I am Chris Stirewalt, his colleague, his friend, and Major Domo in his absence. And I will tell you something. There is a kind of preacher who, whatever he or she is talking about, they impart with the gravamen and authority of as if they were speaking of the end of times. If they're telling you about how they need more hash brown casserole for the upcoming potluck, or talking about the parking protocols for the second lot, they really lay it on. And they're stealing the credibility and authority of their larger subject matter for everything that they talk about and for themselves. And I got to thinking that that is true also of national security experts. It is very hard sometimes to sort out what is true, what is not true, what is a serious threat, what is deeply concerning, and what is just part of the vicissitudes of life in a complicated and fallen world. But there are exceptions, just as there are good preachers. There are good experts on these questions. And Lord, do we need one right now? Because things are weird. Not weird, or maybe weird in only the very best way, is Kori Schake. She is my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, where she is, and I will get the title right because it is important. She is the Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Kori Schake was, among other things, has worked at the Department of Defense. She has worked for, I know that you were a senior advisor to John McCain's 2008 campaign. I know that is true. I know that you were at the Hoover Institution. I know that you taught at West Point. I know that you have written a number of books, including a really good one about the transition from the British Empire to the U.S. Empire. I know that you can ride a mechanical bull. I know a lot of things about you. It's true. But most of all, I know that you are sober-sided, realistic, and reliable when talking about these things. So welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you, my friend. It's a great pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Okay, so as it works out, you have a great piece recently in the Dispatch asking a very cheerful question, which is it World War III already? Are we there yet? And I want to talk about these larger questions. I want to start on this question that puzzles me. And it's not whether or not you will be the Governor General of the Gaza casino complex. It is, we just went through this whole thing about AI when the Chinese DeepSeek made us all feel embarrassed. How much do you think about artificial intelligence as a national security issue versus an economic issue, or are those separable questions?
I think they are separable questions. And in some ways, the issue of TikTok raises the divergence between what can be incredibly fun and profitable economically, also proving to be a major national security risk. Because of the aggregation of data that allows the algorithm to identify patterns in large, messy data sets, which is one of the most difficult things that intelligence analysts and military targeters have to do. So yeah, I do think there are ways in which artificial intelligence is going to dramatically assist the countries that are willing to move forward with it in pattern recognition and targeting, in use of military forces. I don't worry about that because it's a natural progression as technology changes warfare. And we've seen lots of iterations of that. What I genuinely worry about artificial intelligence is that those of us who live in free societies are going to have big, loud arguments and come to reasonable conclusions about the appropriate applications. and our adversaries are not going to be bound by the rules that we bind ourselves on. And that can be an extraordinary advantage in the speed of military operations, in the ability to identify intelligence patterns. I worry about that piece of it a lot, Chris.
So I'm trying to think of what an analog would be, but it would be maybe nuclear testing that the United States was, after an initial round, was circumspect about additional nuclear testing. And the Soviets said, we'll blow stuff up whenever we want, whatever we want. And that we had different guardrails around those things than they did. Is that kind of a thing?
Yeah, I think that is a good one.
Okay.
Also, the limits on targeting civilians in warfare, right, is something that the American military is incredibly careful about, but we should have no reason to believe that our adversaries would or are being equivalently careful.
So we're trying to step it up on that front, right? The United States is investing huge sums of money now into AI. We have this, they call it Stargate. We're going to do, obviously, it's very modest in the naming. They're going to do all this stuff to get going. And so there is a market and consumer facing side, but there's a national security side too. And this is an arms race. AI is also an arms race.
Yeah, it absolutely is an arms race. And I'm not an expert on the technology, but what I understand from folks like Klon Kitchen who are, is that one of the reasons that this new Chinese model could make such fast advances is because they are piggybacking on the data and architecture that American firms are pouring money in to try and advance. And so it's going to be the Wild West out there while this shakes out. The other thing is the U.S., the Chinese firm that you spoke of has made fast advances in software, but there are real hardware limitations that U.S. export controls, in particular of silicon chips, are placing on non-Western firms to be able to continue to make those kinds of advances.
So it's not that the export restrictions didn't work, it's that they're imperfect. It's
also that what we are seeing is progress made by firms before the export controls went into effect.
Okay.
So you're exactly right. It's not that export controls don't work. It's that there are legacy chips that are going to perk through, and companies are going to be able to make advances with those.
Okay. How should I be thinking about China? I guess that means, how is China thinking about us? In this area and every other area, when I listen to Republicans in Congress, when I talk to Republican members of Congress, they say, it sounds like they're coming across the Strait of Taiwan. It is now. They're building up their military, and we're close to real kinetic operations, and it's now. I listen to other people who say it's complicated. There are trading partners. There are a lot of things. They have their own internal political struggle. When you assess what the China threat is, what do you tell a layperson like me?
Yeah. So as you said in the introduction, I'm the captain of a pirate ship of foreign and defense policy experts. And we have three warring tribes that come to different assessments on China. The first is Hal Brams and Michael Beckley, who argue that historically the most dangerous countries are countries that were rising powers and stall.
Germany.
That's Germany in 1914. That's Japan in 1937. That's China now, right? That just as we are gearing up for a government-wide approach to a stampedingly successful China, that is no longer the China we are looking at. We are looking at a China that is going to have slower economic growth rates than the United States. That's probably never going to surpass the U.S. because they're about to collapse demographically. But
this is the one-child policy. This is the demographic hangover of way too many men, not enough women, and that.
Exactly. Exactly. So they are going to grow old before they grow prosperous. And Hal and Michael believe that means we don't have a long-term China problem, but we have an urgent near-term China problem. So throw all of your resources and policy at forestalling Chinese aggression in the next couple of years. The second school of thought is Derek Scissors, the economist, and he thinks that, China's bargain with its population was prosperity in return for limited political liberty. And as the prosperity side of the equation collapses, the Chinese Communist Party can't afford a war even if they'd win it because they can't be confident they could retain control of the country. And the third tribe is Fred Kagan and Dan Blumenthal, who believe that the use of military force by China is their worst option because they can't be confident that they could succeed. But what they are doing is chipping away at the autonomy of Taiwan, other countries involved in the South China Sea disputes. They are succeeding in suborning an independent Taiwan by the constant pressure and economics underpinnings of the economy. And I think all three of them could prove right in different time frames.
Explain how can those three all be right?
So I do think it's true that China is succeeding without the use of military force. But the Chinese government can probably do math just as well as we do and realizes that the window of their power is closing. And so it looks to me like they are trying to grab things while they still might have the opportunity to change the rules to their advantage. And that could actually also result, and I hope it does result, in the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party control over the country.
Okay. And we have a vote in this too, because how we act and what we do will be reflected back to us in the choices that they make. I wonder what they think we think about them. Do they think that we think that they're an existential threat about to happen? What do they think we think?
The Chinese are pretty flattered to be considered the power we are most worried about, right? Because their theory of the United States is that what the Iraq War and the War on Terror overreach and the 2008 financial crisis and our loud, disputatious political polarization.
You got that right.
They think we're a declining power and their time is now. And to be honest, we're doing a fair amount to reinforce that mistaken impression on their part. But what they can't understand is the dynamism of American society, right? We're not good at having it right, but we're pretty good at getting it right.
I like that. I subscribe to that. Okay, so right now, the less than 1% of our federal budget that goes to foreign aid is in doubt. Some is still flowing. Direct aid to some key countries is still flowing. But USAID, which was created in the late 90s to administer U.S. foreign aid, doesn't exist or it's unclear. Critics of the move say China, this is great for China because China is pumping out influence, dollar diplomacy in the developing world, and they're going to buy the friends that we're leaving behind. How should we be thinking about U.S. foreign aid as a tool of diplomacy, of statecraft?
Yeah, I think the original mistake was ever operating under the pretense that American foreign assistance should be independent of our diplomacy and national interests. And our enemies don't believe it's independent of our policy. The recipients of aid don't believe it's independent of our policy. The only people who think that American foreign assistance has no connection to our interests in the world are American taxpayers. And so I do think it's a good idea to formally reintegrate the U.S. Agency for International Development back into the State Department. And I think it was also a mistake to give the USAID director a direct line to the president rather than having to go through the Secretary of State.
An instrument rather than an autonomous entity.
And it can do a lot of good, does do a lot of good in the world. But the fact that very often USAID prides itself on not advancing American interests, I think is unsustainable. And they're now going to get every bad program they ever funded is going to get thrown back at them. I just hope we won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm less worried about China swooping in and making friends all over the world. Because, first of all, China is already the world's largest creditor because of the Belt and Road Initiative. And a lot of those investments are never going to be profitable. That's the reason the Bretton Woods institutions wouldn't have made those loans. So they've got a ball and chain around their ankle already. And I'm not sure, USAID projects tend not to turn profits. And so it's hard for me to see how the Chinese are going to think it's a great idea to float more money when sooner or later they're going to have to face Chinese taxpayers about those loans.
So can I put you in the camp when it comes to USAID and foreign aid generally in the we'll see what happens category, that there are good things that may come out of this disruption, but that there are also, if the important stuff is done, I don't know how much money we give Egypt, let's say, but I assume we give Egypt a lot of money, and we pay Egypt by my reckoning to be stable. That's what we're paying Egypt to do, is that it's cheaper for us to have a stable Egypt next door to Israel in a very difficult neighborhood. We tried it the other way with the Muslim Brotherhood in charge, and we didn't like it. And that it's cheap. That this is a good return on investment, and that kind of money will continue to flow. And it sounds like Marco Rubio, that's what he wants to do. It sounds like he wants to keep that stuff going. He just wants to get it in hand.
So there's more than one variety of foreign assistance, and most of what we give to Egypt, for example, isn't USAID, digging wells and building schools. It's mostly military assistance for the reason that you write. So that's not likely to be affected. But for example, assistance to help the government of Iraq get its central bank in order, that's in our interest too. But there have been a lot of questionable projects, and we're going to hear a lot about a lot of questionable projects.
Sesame Street broadcasts, yes, in the developing world, yes.
It would be really... So let me be clear, Chris. Yes. I am pro Sesame Street broadcasts all over the place.
That's good.
But I do think we're about to take a blowtorch to USAID when a meat cleaver would be plenty enough damage.
All right. Now, I have to ask about the Gaza proposal. And I'm leery about asking about the Gaza proposal because I think it may be fake, in the sense that Donald Trump was in a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he came out and he said something totally wild, right? The United States we're going to own, he said, Gaza. And then everyone said, well, you said you were against boots on the ground overseas. You were against everything. And then as the White House clarified and Rubio clarified, said, well, what we mean is that the Israelis are going to purge Gaza of the Palestinians, of the people who are there. We're going to ship those people to other Arab states who are going to take them in. And then in this hollowed out Gaza, once it's secured, the United States will come in and take it over and run it as, I guess, a spot for development. I don't imagine a world in which that happens. Could that happen, though? Is that an insane thing to think?
It is an insane thing to think.
Yeah.
The notion that, every step of the plan that you outlined, which is the forcible depopulation of Palestinians, the willingness of surrounding countries to accept them, the support of America's friends in the Middle East and beyond for that plan, and the willingness of international investors to turn it into Monte Carlo on the back of all those bad decisions. I think all of those things are unrealistic. Moreover, this is just one more example of the chaos premium we are paying in a Trump administration where he just pulls rabbits out of his hat.
And it makes the Saudis, I think, are a great example here. The successes of the first Trump administration on foreign policy, chief among them, and there are not a ton, but chief among them, were the Abraham Accords and the agreement that, when we watched Gulf Arab states defend Israel against an Iranian bombardment, I said, we are in a different time, right? We are definitely in a different time to watch the Saudis and other Gulf Arab states intercepting Iranian missiles to protect Israel. Wow, this is really different. The response from the Saudis to the proposal that we absolutely are not going to do anything like this. We are not purging Gaza. We are not accepting. This is wrong. I wonder. So, let me put it in the light most favorable to the rabbit puller, and the light most favorable. And this is something that the rabbit pullers supporters often do, which is they say, well, he's starting a conversation. We've begun a conversation. This is what they said about NATO, right? Which is when Donald Trump was running for president the first time, he said, NATO is trash. NATO is the worst. And proponents said, NATO enthusiasts, and I will point out the most successful treaty organization ever in human history, probably, said, you can't talk this way about our closest allies. This is the Western order. This is how we keep the Russians at bay. This is the whole thing. And then in the end, because of the stuff that Trump said, and of course, probably more so because of the things Vladimir Putin was doing, that NATO said, we're going to ramp up, these countries ramped up their military contributions. And Donald Trump was able to say at the end of his term, look at how much more NATO countries are contributing to defense now than they were when I came in. And the people say, yeah, he was pulling rabbits out of his hat, but look, we started a rabbit farm. Look what we did with all of those rabbits. Is there something to be said for a radically new way of thinking about what to do with a problem that we have had since the creation of Israel, basically? So we have this problem that we've had since the creation of Israel, and nothing has proved to be a lasting success. Is there something to be said for just outside of the hat thinking?
So, Chris, I love that you turned my pulling rabbits out of a hat into a Fibonacci sequence of a rabbit population. That was right. So elegant.
That's right.
I'm super impressed. It's certainly true that radical new thinking can unlock unexpected solutions. But the other side of the equation is that I think President Trump and the people around him underestimate the extent to which American power is enabled by people wanting us to succeed, by thinking that we are different and better than other great powers, more trustworthy, more principled, and stuff like we're going to depopulate Palestinians from their homeland, force them on surrounding countries, and then we're going to make money on this waterfront property. That sounds a lot like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And it doesn't sound a lot like, I don't know, pick your favorite American president.
Calvin Coolidge. But
and
I've chosen just for listeners who won't see this, I've chosen Charles Evan Hughes as my screen name today, just in my endless nods to the
So I feel like
Coolidge
the
admin.
Washington Naval Accords that Charles Evan Hughes made possible are one of the great underappreciated American foreign policy achievements.
Preach it, sister. Okay, so we have the outline of an initial proposal on Ukraine from Donald Trump. And the proposal is basically, well, there's the Ukraine will give us rare earth deposits in exchange for continued assistance. And Ukraine will give up the territory that it's lost, essentially. It's what it sounds like to me. And that will redraw the boundaries of Ukraine and everybody will walk away. It seems like a pretty raw deal for Ukraine, right? Well, the opening proposal from Team Trump sounds like a pretty raw deal, but I also have to imagine that Ukraine is utterly exhausted. It's a bigger country than most Americans think, but it's not a huge country, and it's not a rich country, and they've been fighting for a long time. And how do you think? How do they perceive it, and what happens from here?
Yeah. I think I would separate off the first element that here's how Ukraine is going to pay us for the assistance we're providing, because I think that proposal was dreamed up by well-intentioned people who feared that the Trump administration would cut off military assistance to Ukraine. And so they were looking for anything that might buy time for Ukraine, in the way that, offering it as loans. When did Britain finish paying back their World War I or World War II loans to the United States? You can buy a lot of runway for continued assistance that way. And I think well-meaning people did great work to persuade the administration of that. The terms of the deal, I am skeptical that as exhausted and impoverished and anxious as Ukraine justifiably is after 3 years of war, I am skeptical that a Ukrainian government of any stripe could remain in office conceding territory to the Russian invasion, given the war crimes that the Russians have committed. So I think that's one problem. I think the second problem is that Russia doesn't just want the territory they're already in possession of. So I think actually Vladimir Putin's intransigence is likely to save us from a bad deal being proposed and accepted on the basis of what President Trump wants to have happen.
We've watched Vladimir Putin in Chechnya, in Georgia. We've watched again and again a willingness to wait, right? International condemnations, sanctions come in, and he waits, and they wait, and their willingness to bleed their army and go through all of this stuff, and they wait out the West, basically.
Yeah.
Am I correct to assume that what Putin figures is that whether it's this round or a later round, sooner or later, everybody will just give up and he'll get most of what he originally wanted out of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think what Putin wants out of Ukraine is a crushing of an independent Ukraine. That either formally it will become part of Russia, or it will be so badly suborned that it's controlled by Russia and has no claim to an independent foreign policy, an independent economy, an independent culture. I think that's what we saw in the other places that you mentioned, and that's what we saw after 2014, when Russia, under teensy pressure from the international community, chose to bide its time for a while unless Russia loses in Ukraine, there's not going to be an end to the war in Ukraine. There will simply be a postponement. And that's because of Russia's ambitions, not anything else.
When I see that North Korean soldiers come into the fight, should I interpret that as Putin unwilling to continue, or unwilling or unable to find conscripts or volunteers from the Russian population? Is this a sort of a mercenary situation where you bring in foreign fighters because you can't or won't raise the army out of your own population?
I think that's exactly right, Chris. The casualties that the Russians have already tolerated are just eye-popping. And Vladimir Putin appears to try and be avoiding conscripting people from St. Petersburg, Moscow, the major Russian cities, which suggests that at some level, he's fearful of the Russian public's reaction. He's fearful of an anti-war movement. He's fearful of collapsing public support. So the North Korean mercenaries are an enormous lifeline for the Russian war effort, and that the Russians rushed them into the front lines, and neither the North Korean nor the Russian leadership was concerned about the massive casualties that they're taking makes me sad for the people of Russia and North Korea.
There are many reasons each day to be sad for the people of North Korea. That's a bad draw. How long can this really go on? I suppose. Well, maybe the first part of that question is: our European allies go back and go? It seems like the politics of this have moved to the backseat in the United States during the election and before the 2024 election. Ukraine aid was a huge area of controversy, big political battles. Americans don't seem to be focused on it right now. It will come back, I'm sure, in the coming month as the Congress hashes out a spending fight, but it's not today. But it continues to churn in Europe as some European countries are adamant about more and more stronger and stronger support for Ukraine, and others we see a shying away. How do you assess the other Ukraine's other allies' willingness to stay in this with them?
Yeah. One thing I learned doing coalition politics when I was in the Pentagon, when I was in the State Department, and when I was on the NSC is that it is a mistake to think if the U.S. steps back, others will step forward. What happens instead is when the U.S. steps back, everybody else starts to get fearful. They can't succeed without us, and they step back further. So what doesn't happen is, American allies eat their spinach and become Popeye and step forward. What happens is they lose confidence that they can succeed, and cooperation begins to falter. Countries begin to think they are going to have to accept bad outcomes for themselves because they don't have the strength to force good outcomes for themselves. And I think we begin to see that happening.
I can't believe that Vladimir Putin has been able to hold on as long as he has. When those reversals start in the early fighting and the huge losses and the obvious incompetence, I thought, well, there's no way that these oligarchs who put him in power are going to let him stay in power. Did that surprise you at all?
It has surprised me. Yeah, it really has. 25 years into Putin's control of the country, I think I at least underestimated the extent to which once a terror state has been established, it is just so dangerous for anybody to plan or cooperate or take brave stands. And I think the Prigozhin mutiny was so interesting because it was such an outlier, and because his argument was Putin's failing at this. We need to succeed at it.
And this is the director of is it Wagner or Wagner?
It depends on just how European you want to be. Wagner's just fine.
Wagner's just fine. There was a bizarre and very medieval story that played out where the basically the Duke, it would be like the Duke of Norfolk coming against the crown. It was such a weird thing. And then he obviously very accidentally died in a plane crash. It was a very obviously completely accidental plane crash in which
But the Russian military didn't move against him when he was marching on Moscow. I think it's very hard to tell in authoritarian societies just how brittle they are before they fracture.
And that was the lesson of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Was that we did not see it coming, or few people saw it coming, but it was very, very brittle. It was big, it was heavy, but it was brittle, and it could not adapt. And when it tried to adapt, all the cracks came through. I wonder how, when we think about what Western Europe, what Europe is capable of in terms of self-defense and how they're thinking about this now. Run through the roster, if you will, of the players. You did a lot of NATO work. Let's start with the biggest one, Germany. Germany seems to be going through it right now politically. And they were the first to the fight. They ramped up. By the way, who would have thought that we would have said, hey, good news, Germany's really building up its military. Good news.
We've got a militaristic Germany again.
Right. Looking east, Germany builds up military has not historically been a favorite headline in the United States. But Germany got in, got big. Now they seem to be stepping away. What should we be thinking about with Germany?
So Germany is exactly as you say, agonizing over this, because since the end of the Cold War, Germany has desperately wanted to reduce spending on its military in order to help reconstruct the eastern lender of the country, to knit the country.
Still unfinished. A work that is still unfinished.
A work that is still unfinished. But they did deploy to Afghanistan. They also refused to participate in operations in Libya. So it's a sort of veering from one course to another. And the elections going on in Germany ought to have a major effect on this, because what Germans have to decide for themselves is whether they are willing to run government deficits in order to fund the military that their public believes they now need, and which they are getting a lot of pressure from us and others. And it cuts against the anxieties of the past, right? The Germans, I love the way that Mario Draghi, I think it was, said that Germany thinks that finance is an area of moral philosophy. So they don't want to run deficits, but they also really understand that Europe is a much more dangerous place, and the United States is becoming a much less reliable security guarantor. And so they need to step up, but they are being surpassed. I mean, Poland carries more weight in military councils than NATO. Finland will very quickly carry more weight in NATO councils, because they have, both of those countries have militaries that could win a war against the Russians.
For real?
Yes.
Wow.
I mean,
I guess the Finns,
Ukraine.
Finns have been there. They have the experience and the proximity to take it very seriously, and so do the Poles.
Absolutely right. And they have built militaries capable of playing to their own strengths and victimizing Russia's vulnerabilities.
No wonder the Russians were so unhappy about the Finns joining the party. Do you ascribe to or subscribe to the idea that whatever territorial ambitions, and I think it's clear from even my very limited reading and understanding of Russian history, that you have Vladimir Putin, Moscow is the third Rome, pan-Slavic kind of, he sees himself as a Slavic messiah. He is going to lead the return of Great Russia, and that means the Baltic states, and that means Belarus. This means Ukraine. This means all of that. Maybe not everything that was in the former Soviet Union, but certainly a lot of that. One of the reasons that many people did not foresee how big Putin would go in Ukraine was that Putin was assumed to be a rational actor, right? That he's a rational actor. This is like the debate. I want to talk to you about Iran next, but that Vladimir Putin is he's a bad man, but he's a rational actor. And trying to invade Ukraine is an irrational act, and therefore he will not do it. He'll threaten it. He'll nibble off pieces. He'll go for it. Was the size of the invasion? What have we learned about how Vladimir Putin sees the world and who he is as a result of this action?
Much more risk tolerant than I think I anticipated and many others. I think also I thought Russia could achieve its objectives without invading Ukraine, right? That they could intimidate, undercut, corrupt Ukraine, and they could count on Western countries to be fearful to involve ourselves too deeply, and that could produce the kind of political compromises. So Putin was less confident of that than I was.
But they'd done it before, right? They had succeeded even in Ukraine in undermining and destabilizing the government there. And it seemed like it was going to be, if it wasn't, it was going to be a satellite.
Yeah. And so, but all of us underestimated Ukraine's resolve not to become a victim of Russian spheres of influence. And the reaction of Ukrainians reminds me of the reaction of the people of West Berlin in the 1950s and 60s, which is shaming the rest of us with their physical courage in the face of aggression and calling on us to be brave enough to help them when they're the ones at risk.
Amen. Amen. I will get choked up even talking about it, but the Ukrainians holding church services in their subway during the bombardment.
Yeah. 5% of America's defense budget, Ukraine is fighting for their liberty. And you're right to get choked up about it. It's ennobling to be able to help them and to be on the side of virtue in this regard when people are being that brave.
Okay. If I am a mullah in Tehran, if I'm even,
I love that vision of you.
If that happens, things have gotten really weird. If they're recruiting from Appalachia for the mullahs, our problems are either just beginning or over with Iran. If I am an Iranian elite, or even just whatever bourgeois, whatever sort of a broad middle class is left in Iran, I look at the world and I say, we have huge problems. The Saudis are in cahoots with the Israelis. The wedge that was between Sunni Islam and Israel is weakened or gone. The Russians, our protectors, are bogged down, and world oil production outside of this neighborhood is up, and we're isolated and we're alone. I would want,
and Israel just collapsed their strategic depth.
yeah, I would want a nuclear bomb too. If I was an Iranian, I would definitely want a nuclear bomb. How do we prevent that from happening? And what do we do? 30 seconds, fix Iran.
I think the best way to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is to make clear that if they make any moves towards it, we will destroy the nuclear infrastructure and the leadership of the regime will not survive it. So threaten both the industrial base of producing it and threaten the leadership. The problem is that the United States struggles to do that credibly because the last 3 or 4 presidents have all said, we want to get out of wars in the Middle East. And so we have a credibility problem, which typically the best way to shore up American credibility is to be allied to a country that looks more credible than we are. And fortunately, in the Middle East, we have more than one of those allies. And so the Iranian leadership says they're not going to make a deal with the United States, given that we repudiated the last one we made with them. But they may not have a better option than that if we can credibly threaten that we will destroy the Iranian nuclear program and that the leadership won't survive it.
How much damage you mentioned what the Israelis were able to do. How much damage do we think that the Israelis really did to Iran's military infrastructure?
So what they did so brilliantly is they targeted Iranians' air defenses. So they didn't destroy the infrastructure of the nuclear program, but by destroying the air defenses, they made clear that they've got their next shot ready. And so I thought that was, the Israelis are very often described as great tacticians and poor strategists, but that was a really elegant choice that they made because they could have done more. But what they signaled to the Iranian leadership is, you guys are now exposed. If you take another shot at us, you know what's coming.
How, from a military standpoint, and then we'll wrap up in this delightful neighborhood. From a military standpoint, Israel succeeded. We can say that they've succeeded in their mission against Hamas. Can we call that a success? I mean, not all the hostages have been released, but can we call it a success?
They certainly destroyed Hamas's ability to control Gaza. I think they succeeded at that, certainly. And they succeeded in brushing back Hezbollah and other regional actors who partner with Hamas. And that's beneficial. The Houthi are on notice as well. But I'm hesitant to suggest that Israel has succeeded because I don't see what the end game is for them in Gaza. And I think military operations are instrumental in creating a political outcome that you want. And I don't see the political outcome yet.
I don't know whether you take a position on these things. Is the two-state solution, I know it's a buzz phrase, is that a real possible thing that can work? Is that a thing that really could work, or are we done with that discussion now? Has that been obviated?
No, I don't think it's workable, and no, I don't think there's an alternative.
Oh, fun.
I think this is bad, and it's going to be bad until the kaleidoscope turns and there are other political or military options. I just think that I don't see where this goes towards a political solution, because I don't think, without giving Palestinians some governance ability that's going to produce good outcomes for them and thereby make Israel secure. But I also think that even possibly even before the October attacks on Israel, Israelis' confidence had been collapsed that peace was possible. And so it's bad and it's going to stay bad, I think.
You're just a bright ray of sunshine for us on this February day. Okay. I want to read to you. I want to read you to you. With land wars in Europe and the Middle East and tensions running high in Asia, speculation has only grown louder that we are on the brink or in the early stages of World War III. We are not. There has not been a foreign attack on the U.S. homeland that would motivate the country to undertake a major national effort to preserve our freedom. Governments allied with the United States are not being toppled or their territories occupied. Major powers are not fighting each other directly. U.S. troops are in combat in relatively small numbers for limited regional purposes. But a world war is approaching. Please tell the class about your piece and what you meant in writing it.
So the exam question that was posed to me was, are we in a world war? And no, we are not, because things could be so much worse than they are now. But we're on our way to things being worse than they are now. If we allow Russian aggression to tear up the rules that have made Europe secure and prosperous since 1945, and that expanded that security into the areas of the former Warsaw Pact, the Balkans, and even the former Soviet Union. That will create an instability that will make governments start to make cowardly choices rather than brave choices, that will inhibit investment and productive economic activity. So being sinking in quicksand. In Asia, if we, the defense of Taiwan is to our moment what the defense of Berlin was in the 40s and 50s. It is both indefensible and essential to defend, which means you have to deter aggression and hope you don't have to fight it. And we are not building a military with a wide enough margin of error over our adversaries that our adversaries aren't tempted to test us. And that's how world wars start, with countries believing they deserve regional spheres of influence, beginning to cooperate with each other, and us not making the essential investments and the essential political commitments of stability and security that will forestall us being tested.
How are we doing at the work of modernizing? I hear and read with a lot of fascination how the Pentagon and others are ramping up on drones and are ramping up on other ways of fighting, and thinking anew and acting anew. It sounds expensive and it sounds hard for an institution that in its 250 years runs on tradition, and runs on doing it the Army way. How do you see the project to harden to use technology and use new approaches to increase the opportunity cost for bad actors?
It's such a great question. And I agree with your judgment that it's both hard and expensive to do military reform, and that the United States isn't great at it. I mean, traditionally, the American way of war is, as that Revolutionary War hero Nathaniel Greene described it, we fight, we lose, we get up and fight again.
Yeah.
If you think about the North Africa campaign in World War II as drawing blood while the American military figured out how to fight, I think I rate very highly the initiative and adaptability of the American military. I rate very low the appropriateness of the funding level we have provided them and the sclerotic nature of our acquisition system. That makes it very difficult to bring technological innovation quickly into the force. In Ukraine right now, there's a great article in The Economist this last week about electromagnetic warfare in Ukraine. They are seeing cycles of innovation that are 6 to 8 weeks long. How long do you think it takes to acquire, I don't know, an iPhone for the United States Army? It's way longer than 6 or 8 weeks. And so we desperately need to up our game. And one quick way to help up our game is to start throwing money at the problem so that we can actually restock the munitions, not that we've given to Ukraine, that we have failed to buy in the last 15 years. We need to really rebuild the defense industrial base and find more churn in our system of acquisition so that we can bring the kinds of technologies that are driving such disruptive innovations in the American economy into our military forces.
Okay, last thing. I listened to Pete Hegseth's confirmation hearings at the Senate, and it was not super useful for me. Hearings almost are never useful, but it was not useful to me as a journalist or a scholar or a citizen, because we talked a lot about Pete Hegseth's misspent youth. We talked a lot about how basically he thought, and the Republicans asking him questions thought, that the United States military was wussified, and that we are a military of wusses who are more interested in celebrating Martin Luther King Day than are interested in killing people and breaking things. How much should I credit the complaint about how diversity, equity, and inclusion and that kind of stuff affects our warfighting ability? How much of the if I could give you, and I would, if I could give you a free hand and say, Dr. Schake, you have 18 months to do anything that you want to do with unlimited funds to fix and get the U.S. Military machine where you think it ought to be. How much of that relates to warrior culture and that stuff that we've heard so much about?
So I like the way Georgetown professor Heidi Urban describes it, which is to say, the longest war the United States military has ever fought is the culture war.
Yeah.
Right. And the American military would love to be left out of this particular political dispute. They would have loved to have been left out it on the way up, and they want to be left out of it on the way down. I would say there is some legitimate concern about lack of mission focus. And that lack of mission focus is fatal in warfare. But that has to be balanced against the fact that we need a military that actually reflects American society, right? And 70% of recruits in the American military come from the South and the West. 87% of those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who deployed to Afghanistan were men. And so there are some practical realities that we have been unreasonable in imposing on the military that they wish they could avoid. And that now there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm for a return to mission focus. But that's going to come at some cost of distancing from the broader society.
And part of and I said that was going to be the last question, but this will really, really, really be the last question. Something that you and I have talked about before and you've written about, and I think about a lot as a West Virginian, is we have an all-volunteer force, but as you say, it does not draw equally or evenly from across the nation. Places like West Virginia are way overrepresented in our armed forces. Not a lot coming from Chevy Chase, Maryland. And there has been an othering or separation, and sought by both sides, right? A general populace that doesn't want to think about the military and dealing with the military, other than to leave a parking spot at the Home Depot or applauding at a baseball game. On the other side, there is a military culture that wants to be a warrior culture, separate and apart from the civilian people. It's not, they don't want to be citizen soldiers. They want to be a military caste. Can we address it? Is there a way to, we're never going to be Minutemen again, right? We're never going to be that. That's a very nice story we tell ourselves, but that's not what works in the modern era. Is there anything that we can do to reintegrate America into the military and the military into America?
It's such a great question. And I love it that you pitched one slow and over the middle of the plate to me, because I just finished writing a history of American civil military relations. It comes out in September.
Is this just a tease? We have to buy the book to find out. I understand. That's fine.
This tension has been endemic in American society even before the volunteer force, right? Like Samuel Adams writes about this tendency of the military to view themselves as a society apart from the broader American body politic. And there was a lot of concern when George Washington and the Revolutionary War military founded the Society of the Cincinnati. Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin thought this was creating a military caste that was going to run the country, a new kind of aristocracy, militarized. So it's not a new problem, but given how small our military is to the size of our population, there is an enormous amount of distancing, exactly as you suggest. And it creates cynicism by folks in the military. It also has the tendency to create Praetorianism, the sense that they're different and better than the rest of American society. I think there are two things we can and should do. First, we should approach with humility when we are asking the military to do anything other than fight and win our wars.
Mm-hmm.
We have a tendency, because they are a command organization, that they will do what you lawfully order them to do. We have a tendency to use them for social experimentation in ways that we should approach with greater humility than we have approached in the past. And the second thing is treat them as normal, right? Invite your military neighbors over to dinner. Figure out how many schools their kids have gone to, and offer to drive to sport. I mean, the civil military relations in the United States can withstand a lot of friction. What they wither with is indifference.
And, one of the things I will say, I grew up with a lot of veterans growing up in West Virginia, but I've never lived around or near or had more friends or acquaintances who are active military than I do living in Washington, D.C. It is one of the weird, cool things about Washington, D.C. is they're everywhere. You can't, they're everywhere, and you see the BDUs in line at the Starbucks, and you're like, oh yeah, here I am in Fort Washington, Washington, D.C. Folks, if you can you imagine how good this book is going to be, having just spent an hour with Kori Schake? Can you imagine how good it will be? What a good writer she is, how decently patriotic, how fair-minded, how smart, and how experienced. You should pre-order the book now, because it's going to be good. Dr. Schake, thank you so much. You are a good friend and an obliging colleague. Thank you so much for doing this with us today.
This was such a fun conversation, Chris. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, my friend.
Heck yeah. Well, that was awful good. I was asking Victoria whether or not we should say where Jonah is, and then we both realized neither of us have any idea where Jonah is, and she's in his house. So we know one place he's not in his house. Will he return? Yes. I feel confident that Jonah will return to you and free you from my ministrations. But I warn you, there's another Stirewalt infused episode of The Remnant coming up later this week. So stay tuned for that. And until then, We'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is my podcast.